I want to give you one announcement. I think the lectures are going to be over soon, probably by the end of next month. We have two more topics. They are rather small topics, but we will continue with this one for some time. And then, as time permits, we have to finish anyway the voiteurism lecture, and then the final one would be business cycles. And in the meantime, we will also have a test. One test you completed, and we need to have another test. And I'm thinking of bringing some MCQ questions for you for that, to make an assessment about your understanding of the basic concepts and theories and models that we have learned, rather than the empirical things. Empirical things will focus more on that for the final exam. So the classroom test, or whichever the test that we are going to decide, basically about the concepts, theories, models, basically about the model that we learn. Right, so those are the two announcements. Let's focus on the lesson today.
So that test will be on-site one or an online one?
That I haven't decided. We can also have an online one. Online test we conduct for the undergraduate programs. So similar one we can have for the master's program also. So, but whenever you enter the exam, the time count starts, and then when the time is over, it automatically goes off. And so that you have to make sure that before the time ends, you complete the answer script and submit it. Also submission through the online. Right. Foreign exchange market respond to the fiscal policy. And we mentioned that last time. This is the connection between fiscal policy and the balance of payment. So the fiscal policy and the exchange rate. Fiscal policy leads to BOP surplus if you have perfect capital mobility. It leads to BOP deficit if you have no capital mobility. So then we need to require, under both cases, adjustment is needed. And when we look at the adjustment, again, we need to look at what is the exchange rate system we have. If you have a flexible exchange rate system, adjustment takes place through changes in exchange rate, either depreciation or appreciation. If you have a fixed exchange rate system, or if the central bank, the government, doesn't want to let exchange rate change, then actually adjustment takes place through changes in money supply. So we are going to look at how these things happen, but we take only the two extreme cases first. What are the two extreme cases? The two extreme cases. perfect capital mobility or no capital mobility. Okay, so first we take perfect capital mobility. When we have perfect capital mobility, we know that we learn about it and we should have a BOP line like this. BOP line. So we look at the policy response. Let me complete this one so that I can show you all these things. Yes. We are looking at fiscal expansion. Fiscal expansion. So with fiscal expansion, how do we show it here? Fiscal expansion, we have to shift this IS line upward like this, or rightward. Fiscal expansion. So we were at point A having simultaneous equilibrium in all three markets. What are the three markets? Output market, money market, and the foreign exchange market. So having said that, the economy is at the initial equilibrium point, and then the government increase spending so that AD should go up. That is shown by increasing, shifting the IS line like the red one. So this red line is due to increased fiscal expansion. Now, how does this affect the balance of payments? You can see now the economy is at point B here, and there we have interest rate has gone up to this level and output this level, because it is an increase in aggregate demand, so that output should respond in Keynesian view, so that output increased. When the output increase, that is also interpreted as total income. So the total income increase and through the interaction between money market and the bond market, because money demand also goes up. And when the money demand goes up, interest rate goes up. Which means now the earlier the interest rate was here, which is equal to international rate RF. Now the interest rate has gone up, that is the local rate, to R1, which means now it is higher than foreign rate. Higher than foreign rate means it generates capital inflows. You can see now, because of this here increase in income also generate imports. But however, this one is stronger than the increase in imports. CF surplus because of the higher interest rate, resulting in BOP surplus at the new internal equilibrium point B. BOP surplus due to higher capital inflows. Hope you got the point. That's why we say that fiscal expansion, it does not lead always to a BOP deficit as we knew, but in this case, going to a BOP surplus. So adjustment, now we need to look at adjustment under two headings. One is when the exchange rate is allowed to be flexible, that means market adjustment, or the central bank intervention. So the intervention is adjustment. Let's look at both. First, we have a flexible exchange rate. What will happen when you have a BOP surplus? Now, exchange rate should appreciate in response to that. When it appreciates, net exports should fall down. Exchange rate appreciation result in a higher imports and lower exports. So now you should remember what is our aggregate demand. Aggregate demand equals C plus I plus E plus NX. We are now talking about this NX. NX should fall. NX is part of aggregate demand, so it should affect our IES line. So which means now IES line shift back to the left. That's why we have this backward bending arrow curve. Under flexible exchange rate system, NX falls. So it shifted this line to red one because of the fiscal expansion. Now it is coming back due to trade contraction. And as a result, now interest rate will be back to its initial level. So it is come to equal to the foreign rate, international rate. So that excess capital inflows disappear now, resulting in BOP equilibrium. So all in all, what we have been saying is that although we move to point B, but because of these conditions that we explain here, flexible exchange rate, and this move comes back to point A, so that there has been no change in Y, no change in interest rate at the end of the day. Without any change in those variables, adjustment takes place. Which means now actually there is no reason to increase the government spending, because under these circumstances, it does not bring any policy outcome. Let's look at the other case also under fixed exchange rate. Under the fixed exchange rate, okay, I will fill up those things here. I think you remember this part, so I don't have to explain it. Government increase spending so that aggregate demand should go up, and we show it by shifting the IS line to the right, the red one, and higher domestic interest rate results in capital inflow. And finally, there is a BOP deficit, BOP surplus. Now, the adjustment is the government does not allow or does not intervene does not allow the market forces to make the correction. The central bank has to intervene. So BOP surplus means there is excess foreign exchange in the market. The central bank purchases them. When the central bank purchases foreign exchange in the market, like the one we had, this mandatory conversion of foreign exchange to rupees, we had 25% and it was reduced by the central bank to 15%, like that. What happens? Money supply should go up because the central bank has to pay in the local currency to the commercial banks. Money supply rises. Money supply. So central bank's intervention in the foreign exchange market is also similar to its intervention in the bond market, like using the open market operations. The same thing, similar result. If central bank purchase treasury bills from the market, money supply rises. In the same way, when central bank purchase foreign exchange in the market, money supply rises. How do we show it? An increase in money supply can be shown by shifting LM line to the right. So the blue line explains that we have an increased money supply, which will bring down that interest rate back to RC naught. Because we move from A to B, and now we move from B to C. Lower R wipe out that balance of payment surplus we had at point B. So BOP comes back to 0 at this point. It's because this green line, anywhere BOP is balanced. So now we are at the point B, and at point C, BOP is balanced. And you can see the adjustment is with greater impact on the output level. There is no impact on the interest rate, but there is an impact on economic growth. Economic growth gets accelerated. In the previous case, there is no impact on the economy. Economic growth remains the same. But in this case, economic growth gets accelerated. Why? The two conditions were related, and this will be the result. We ended up at point C. In the previous case, we came back to point A. But you go, yeah, but you follow, you can follow the, but you can follow this explanation, right? Oh, I have to explain it again. Right, okay, anyway, I will explain it again. We are having BOP surplus at point B, that is clear at this point. And from that point onward, because we have the fixed exchange rate, that means exchange rate doesn't change. So the central bank has to purchase the excess foreign exchange. paying in local currency. So when the central bank pay in local currency, money supply rises. And that's what we show by shifting the LM line here. When the money supply increases, the economy moves here and the interest rate back to R0 because of the increase in the money stock. And it also has a positive impact on the output level. So the output level goes up to this. So the point is actually when we have these two conditions, what are the two conditions? One is the perfect capital mobility, which is given by this green BOP line. And the second condition, adjustment under fixed exchange rate. And then the third condition is assumption there is no price impact. Under these conditions, adjustment is with greater output level, with higher economic growth. That's what I explained. Okay, so let's look at the other extreme case also before we move into more general ones. What is the other extreme case? Foreign exchange market response under no capital mobility. That means this is an economy where capital account is closed. The previous case, the capital account is liberalized. But in this case, capital account is closed. So in that case, let me draw these things. Now, I think this is clear. Increase in government spending, aggregate demand should rise. We show it by shifting the IS line. And let's look at higher imports because of the increase in income or increase in aggregate demand. Higher income results in higher imports, causing trade deficit or net export deficit. So the case leads to a BOP deficit. Let's explain it here on the diagram. So I'm going to show you some lines using my red color pointer. No capital mobility means we have a vertical BOP line like this. So in other words, no capital mobility means there are two accounts which determined by BOP, balance of payment outcome, trade account, and the asset account, the capital flows, trade flows, capital flows. But in this economy, capital flows are not allowed. Only trade flows determine the balance of payment outcome. Okay. With that condition, we initial equilibrium is at this point A. All three markets are in equilibrium. You can see interest rate is R0, output is Y0, and the government increase spending resulting in an increase in aggregate demand. So we show it by shifting this IS line to the right. So we are coming to the point B, from A to B. Why we come to A to B? With the increase in output level to this level, also with the increase in interest rate to this level. Now that's what we need to explain. Why? Because an increase in aggregate demand with the shift of this IS line With the increase in aggregate demand, output should respond in Keynesian view, assuming that prices remain constant. Prices don't change. When the output goes up, that will also generate excess demand for money, which results in an increase in the interest rate. Okay, so those are the reasons why we move from A to B. Now we should look at the BOP outcome. What is the BOP outcome at point B? It is mentioned here actually. BOP deficit. Why deficit now? At point B, we have BOP deficit. The deficit is a result of this increase in income level that will generate more imports, resulting in trade deficit. It has nothing to do with capital account because capital account is anyway closed. Therefore, balance of payment outcome is entirely depend on the trade account. Trade account turned to be a deficit. Right, now we look at the adjustment process. Adjustment is under flexible exchange rate. What will happen when we have a flexible exchange rate? Flexible exchange rate means the adjustment takes place with the change in the exchange rate. Either it should appreciate or depreciate. But because we have a BOP deficit here, exchange rate should depreciate. And we have learned that depreciation is good for our trade account because exports should rise, import should fall. Exports should rise because of higher demand for exports. Exports become cheaper after depreciation. Imports become expensive, so that demand falls. So NX rises. Positive movement. But NX is now not only part of BOP, NX is part of BOP, but also part of IS, because it is part of aggregate demand too. Therefore, we should make adjustments to both these lines. What are the both lines? One is the BOP line, and other one is the IS line. We have mentioned it here, IS and BOP lines shift to the right. Okay, the both lines we have to shift to the right to show the impact of this exchange rate depreciation and the increase in trade surplus. Both. So those movements are given here by purple lines, the two purple lines. IS line shift like this. Why? Because of the increase in NX, trade surplus. BOP line shift to this point. Why? Because of the increase in NX, the same thing. BOP line explains that foreign exchange market. IS line explains aggregate demand. So the trade account is part of both. But the point is now actually we don't know where these lines shift. Both shift the same place. So maybe POP line, POIS line shift to this point or like that. So there is no equilibrium in that case. But because we need to conclude our analysis, we get both lines to the same place, point C. So we have higher output, which is here due to higher aggregate demand. And we have higher interest rate that is here. That is due to higher demand for money with higher income level through the interaction of the bond market. So the adjustment with increase output and increase interest rate. What will happen if we change the exchange rate system? The government doesn't want to have a flexible exchange rate system. What will happen there then? Because in this case, exchange rate depreciate. Government doesn't want it to happen. So it intervenes in the market to maintain the fixed exchange rate, a stable exchange rate. And the idea is given in the next graph. With this one, you can see fixed exchange rate. Let's look at how it happens now. So we commence with the point A. I think we understand now. BOP line, because no capital mobility, capital account is not liberalized. Trade account determine the balance of payment outcome. So we have a vertical BOP line, the green line. All three markets are in equilibrium at point A. And at that point, the government decides to increase spending, resulting in higher aggregate demand. So we shift the IS line from this to the red one. We are looking at the internal equilibrium. Okay, internal equilibrium is at point P now. What is the BOP outcome? BOP deficit. Why BOP deficit? We need to explain those logics. And even when you look at the practical, the real world situation, logically we need to articulate the policy outcome. Why BOP deficit? Because of higher aggregate demand, which will generate more imports. You can see it here. So that we have a BOP deficit. What about higher interest rate? Doesn't matter because this economy does not have a liberal capital account. So the adjustment under fixed exchange rate, that means exchange rate is under pressure to depreciate because of the BOP deficit. So the central bank has to intervene by selling foreign exchange in the market. It has to reduce the stock of reserves, take a couple of $millions and give to the banks in exchange for local currency rupees. So the deposits of the commercial banks falls, which means actually money supply falls. money supply falls. How do we show the reduction in money supply on our diagram? We can show it by shifting the LM line to the left, the blue line. The blue line, which means we are coming to point C. We move from point A to B, having BOP deficit, and to correct the BOP deficit, central bank intervene in order to avoid exchange rate depreciation. With the reduction in money stock, we came to point C. What is the outcome? Outcome is this increased output returns back to Y0. With that, imports will be lower again. So there is no any policy implications on the real sector, on economic growth. And the BOP is back to the same point because earlier it caused a BONX deficit, trade deficit. Now it improves the trade deficit. You can cancel out pluses and minuses. So bringing BOP back to equilibrium at point C. The only change that we can notice is the increase in interest rate. So the adjustment is with higher interest rate, but with lower output level. Let's look at the monetary policy implications also in the foreign exchange market. I know that some of you are talking about these things. Sorry, what happens to our monetary policy, monetary expansion. Again, we follow the same conditions. First, we take perfect capital mobility case. Now, implications of monetary expansion on BOP, balance of payment, no foreign exchange market, is always the same. Always the same, regardless of capital, the degree of capital mobility. What is always the same? It always results in a BOP deficit. Now, fiscal expansion was different because under different circumstances, it may cause a surplus and sometimes a deficit. But in this case, under whatever the circumstances, monetary expansion, increased money stock will result in BOP deficit. So how do we show the increase in money stock? We shift the LM line to the right. Okay, so that means we are at point A, having equilibrium simultaneously in all three markets. And then we shift the LM line to the right, this red line, to show that there has been an increase in money stock. increase in money stock. LM line shift to the right. Where is the new equilibrium point? Internal equilibrium, we move from A to B, where IS and LM intersects. So you can see interest rates have gone down. Because always when the money supply increases, if prices do not respond, interest rate should go down. That is because the economy has excess liquidity, and that excess liquidity results in higher demand for bonds in the bond market. So the bond prices should go up and interest rate should go down. And what is the result of BOP here? Because the lower interest rate now, it is lower than the foreign rate RF, there will be capital outflows resulting in BOP deficit. So we have a BOP deficit at point B. Also, you can say it is contributed by higher income level, because this also increased to this level. Deficit at point B. Now, if you have a flexible exchange rate is now depreciating. It is good for our trade account, so that NX should rise. NX is now part of the IS, aggregate demand. Why it is not part of the BOP line? No, it is part of the BOP line too. But BOP line is perfectly elastic, showing the dominant position of capital flows. So you don't have to shift the BOP line. Even if you shift it to the right, it is the same. IS line can be shifted to the right. So this IS line, IS0, shift as IS1, the purple line. The reason? The reason is rising trade account. NX rises due to exchange rate depreciation. So we are back to, we are moving to now point C, from point B to point C because of that. And because aggregate demand has gone up here again from Y0 to earlier to B, and now from B to C, output should rise like this. What about the interest rate? Interest rate has come back to the same point. Output is here. Interest rate is here. So what is our conclusion? BOP is back to equilibrium, but with great impact on the output level. So with higher economic growth, balance of payment deficit is sorted out when there is flexible exchange rate, of course, under the perfect capital mobility case. What happens under the fixed exchange rate? The adjustment under the fixed exchange rate. Now we have a BOP deficit. BOP deficit. So up to this point, we have explained, right? All these things we know now. BOP deficit. And that BOP deficit is at point B here as a result of monetary expansion. So the exchange rate is now under pressure to depreciate, but the central bank intervenes because of this policy to maintain fixed exchange rate, stable exchange rate. What it has to do is to sell foreign exchange and resulting in a reduction in money supply. Now, what was the policy earlier? Increase in money supply. Now, what is the outcome when the central bank intervened? Reduction in money supply. So that's why the same policy will result in a reverse money supply. So we move from point A to B. Now we are back to point A. So what we can say now, actually, there is no change in Y or R both, because R declined earlier, but now back to the same R, which is equal to the international interest rate. So that will stop our capital movements, negative or positive outcome in the capital account. But as far as economic growth is concerned, it doesn't do any good there. We are in the same position without any outcome, policy outcome. The same policy will get reversed in the adjustment process. That's what happens. Same policy get reversed in the adjustment process. No capital mobility. What will happen when there is no capital mobility? So no capital mobility means this green line, vertical line, because capital account is closed, so that the balance of payment outcome is determined by trade account. And the equilibrium point is at A. All three markets are in equilibrium. Having said that, we introduce monetary expansion, so which is the red line now. Money supply increase from LM0 to LM1. We shift the lines to show that increase in money supply, so that we are moving from equilibrium, internal equilibrium point A to B. And the results, output has gone up to this level. Interest rate has come down to this level. I hope you can explain why. Why the output rises, why the interest rate falls. But what about the balance of payments outcome here? It is given here, balance of payment outcome always, I said earlier, always leads to a deficit. So here also it is a deficit at point B. At point B. The adjustment under the flexible exchange rate, the central bank has to allow the market to make the corrections. So market will be cleared with the changes in exchange rate. That means exchange rate now should depreciate. When it depreciates, trade account improves. That means an increase in the net exports. And net exports is part of both aggregate demand, which is shown in the IS line, and the BOP, balance of payment, which is shown in the BOP line. So we have to shift both to the right. That is given by the blue lines. IS shifted to IS1, BOP shifted to BOP1, so that final outcome is higher growth, even higher growth. It stimulates economic growth. But the interest rate is back to the original point. So BOP adjustment with higher economic growth. Our last case, no capital mobility, but adjustment under fixed exchange rate. So the outcome of monetary expansion is again deficit. Deficit. That is at point B. And deficit results in exchange rate depreciation, but it has to be avoided by the central bank by selling foreign exchange. As a result, money supply falls now because money in the deposits flow back to the central bank in exchange for dollars. Money supply falls. How do we show the result? Show the reduction in money supply on our using our tools with this backward bending arrow key again. Earlier, the red line is to show there is an increase in money stock. Now it is returning back to the same point to show that money supply declines. So we are back to point A. No change in interest rate is the same. No change. And balance of payment deficit disappears because of the decline in output level, which lowers the import demand, improving trade account. And capital account doesn't have to work here because there is no capital account. So these are the two extreme cases with perfect capital mobility and no capital mobility, but you can have a sense of how the policies work in countries like those which have capital account restrictions and those countries which have more liberal capital accounts. Okay. And with that, you can actually figure out what will happen with those countries with the imperfect capital mobility. So I have given here Some of the, because we have mentioned the markets respond to the policies and also to the shocks. Both are important, although we look at fiscal policy and monetary policy. We look at both fiscal expansion and monetary expansion. We can also use the same analysis in reverse order to show how the markets respond to fiscal consolidation and tight monetary policy. Apart from those policies, there are other policies which have implications in our markets. And there are external shocks. And today, if you look at external shocks in the world market, you can see increase in interest rates in the United States. And Russian invasion in Ukraine and intensified trade conflict between China and the US, and even natural disasters. So all these things can have an impact on our markets. So I am giving here a list of things that you need to think about and work out how these things can affect our foreign exchange market. For example, increase in tourist arrivals after the end of the war. We experienced that, right? So how the increase, the 2009 end of war affected tourist arrivals, and how do we incorporate that as a shock to our BOP analysis? What will happen is NX should rise now as a result. It's foreign exchange earnings. It should rise. And because it is foreign exchange earning with the service sector, so that domestic CIG can rise too. So with all that, we have to show shifting aggregate demand and BOP, and then look at how the implications of this external shock. Even tourism can decline suddenly, like after the Easter Sunday attack. How do we understand balance of payments implications and adjustment process? We need to apply them to those models and then see how they looks like. Regaining GSP plus concession from EU. What will happen? It is good for our trade performance. So then we look at how it affects our balance of payment outcome and what would be the adjustment process under different exchange rate scenario and capital account scenario. Increase import controls. But now import controls are relaxing, so we should also be able to look at how it affects our this one. Economic slowdown in US, because basically we should be able to think of what are the most important variables that could change as a result of those external shocks. It will affect our export to the US. So with that, we should look at the policy, the shocks implications here. Increase in domestic inflation. So if our inflation increases, what should happen here? So one thing is money supply. We are talking about real money stock. It should fall. That is one thing which can happen. The second thing which can happen, NX falls too because of the appreciation of RER, real exchange rate. So we should be able to use these two things in our model and then look at the policy implications, the inflationary impact, and the adjustment process. Increase in foreign inflation, how does it affect our foreign exchange market? Increase in foreign interest rate, like the US interest rate, capital flows will reverse. And how does it affect our BOP? Some of the examples are given in this list for us to think about and if necessary to work out. And it is good that if you are working, if you are focusing on these things which are happening right now around us, and then analyze them in the context of our models. There's an important implication that I'm going to show you now, which is called Mundell-Fleming model. Mundell and Fleming, these are the names of two economists. They discovered one important phenomena in Western Europe in the 1960s. And then after that discovery, they publish what they found. And that publication, out of that publication, there came out this model called Mundell-Fleming model. Mundell-Fleming model. It actually talks about BOP adjustment, balance of payment adjustment, under perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rate. Okay, fixed exchange rate. Perfect capital mobility means investors can buy and sell assets of a country in unlimited amounts with minimum transaction cost. So that's why we have this horizontal BOP line at the point where R0, that is domestic interest rate, equal foreign interest rate. Perfect capital mobility. Then the fixed exchange rate. Central bank has the responsibility or obligation to avoid exchange rate appreciation or depreciation. In other words, it is the obligation of the central bank to maintain the stable exchange rate without letting it to go up and down. That is fixed exchange rate. If you have both these conditions together, which actually existed in Western Europe, that's why they could discover this. And then if you have both these conditions together, then the central bank does not have independent monetary policy. That is the discovery. Does not have independent monetary policy. That means monetary policy is useless. Now let's look at these things. Even today, when you look at no, I'm not going to mix it up with some other things. Now, for example, we are going to explain this case You can see here IS line, LM line, BOP line. And we start with equilibrium point. All three markets are in equilibrium. Okay. Now, when we are like that, the central bank was to adopt tight monetary policy. You can also take loose monetary policy, doesn't matter. For example, I am taking tight monetary policy because we have been talking about monetary expansion. So now we are taking monetary contraction. Doesn't matter, you can take both ways. What does it mean? It means now this LM line should shift in this direction. Okay. So what happens to the BOP? Because now our internal equilibrium point is here. And we know that output has declined, so there is negative impact on economic growth, but interest rate has gone up to this level. So if the interest rate has gone up, actually there should be a BOP surplus here. I'm taking the Western experience at that time, the same experience. BOP surplus here. Let's move to that point. So here is the reduction in money stock due to tight monetary policy. This is point B, and we should have BOP surplus at point B. So whenever we have a BOP surplus, exchange rate gets appreciated. In the 60s, the world had fixed exchange rates. It changed actually only in the 1970s. So the obligation of the central bank is to avoid exchange rate appreciation here. What does it have to do? It has to mop up excess foreign exchange in the market. That means purchase excess foreign exchange in the market. When it purchases foreign exchange from the market, it has to pay in local currency so that the money supply automatically goes up. Which means this line which came here will now turn back. That's why you have a backward bending arrow key here. So we are coming back to the same point A. So the central bank adopted tight monetary policy in order to achieve some macroeconomic objectives. For example, we say stability, price stability, so that the inflation is round the corner. So the central bank tight monetary policy to address the inflationary impact. As a result of that, there will be capital inflows because of higher interest rate. And now it is again the central bank's obligation to avoid exchange rate appreciation. So it started purchasing foreign exchange, which will expand the money supply. Again, so the tight monetary policy reverse. by the same policy. So, which means central bank has no authority over the monetary policy. In the Eurozone, it is the case, perfect case. Why? Because Eurozone has a single market or common market. Common market means free trade in goods and services, number one. Common tariff with the rest of the world, number two. And the important thing for our discussion here, free mobility of money and people. Free mobility of money. That means perfect capital mobility in the Eurozone. What about fixed exchange rate? Yes, it is fixed. It is single currency. Single currency. So single currency means whenever you trade with between Germany and France, there is no different currencies. It is the same currency. German euro exchange for the same rate with the French euro, fixed rate. Now, which means now if they have these both conditions satisfied, countries in the Eurozone does not have independent monetary policy. That's why they have to surrender their monetary policy. They have to surrender their monetary policy when they get integrated into an economic and monetary union. Let me see the time. Yes. Now, policy response under now it is easy. It is a little complicated when we take imperfect capital mobility. But after you understand the two extreme cases, no capital mobility and perfect capital mobility. After you understand the two, the imperfect case can be worked out easily, avoiding those complications. So we break it into two aspects. One is we are looking at now imperfect capital mobility case, which is more practical case. We break it into two. One is greater capital mobility, like in the developed countries, more advanced countries, United States, they have greater capital mobility, close to perfect capital mobility, greater. Which means now, in that case, what happens is
So we are losing the volume.
Losing?
The voice
Yes, sir.
Really? Okay.
for the last 1 minute. Before that, it was very clear, sir.
Yeah, okay. So now you can hear, I hope.
Yeah.
Right. What I said is that we are going to take this case imperfect capital mobility, which is little more complicated. But after we learn about the previous two cases, perfect capital mobility and no capital mobility, those extreme two cases, then it is easy to work out these complicated matters little bit and simplify it. So imperfect, we split into two. One is greater capital mobility, other one is weaker capital mobility. Greater capital mobility is like those status, capital account status in advanced countries, like the United States. Imagine United States or Western European countries. There, the capital mobility is allowed, reasonably liberal. So in that case, capital account in the balance of payments dominates the current account. That means in those countries, change in the interest rate plays a major role in the foreign exchange market equilibrium. Bringing the BOP equilibrium, interest rate plays a major role. On the other hand, if you have an economy with weaker capital mobility, like, take Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka does not have greater capital mobility. Our capital mobility is very weak because there are a lot of regulations over the foreign exchange transactions in the capital account. So weak capital mobility. In that case, our BOP outcome is determined more by N. Than by capital A and 2. It plays a major role in the foreign exchange market equilibrium. Okay, so that difference, if we keep that in mind, then we can understand the rest. Right. I think we will work out this one next week. For the moment, that's enough for today. So thank you for joining. And if you have anything to ask me, now is the time. Right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you then.
Hi,
Yeah.
sir. Sir, this is not related to the session today, but yesterday I think there was a news that when the central bank converted 3 trillion treasury bills into treasury bonds.
Mhm.
So when something like that happens, what's the impact that comes to the economy, sir?
It is the central bank holdings or the EPF holdings?
It just said central bank had converted 3 trillion. Yeah.
Yeah, that is basically the central bank holding, because central bank is the one which holds mostly the treasury bills.
Yeah.
And it has no impact on the economy. It actually relieves the debt payment. Otherwise, the government is in a position. This is actually part of the DDO, the domestic debt optimization or domestic debt restructuring. The two areas where there is a lot of the structuring happening is central bank and the EPF. So the central bank is having treasury bills, which are short-term debt instruments. That means within less than 1 year, they have to be settled.
Yeah, that's right.
So now they are converted to treasury bonds, means they are long-term instruments. That means you are extending the period of debt payment. That's all what it happens. For example, you have a debt to pay 100,000 rupees within month and you are not able to pay it. So you break it into 25,000, and then say that, okay, within the next 4 months, every month I will pay 25,000.
Right.
It's something like that.
All right. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mm. I think there are other implications of exchange rate movements because our foreign exchange situation has never been strong. It has becoming weaker and weaker over the years. So always the volatility was very high, which actually affect negatively the many other areas. For example, the central bank, when it keeps the exchange rate fixed, it has to, when it allows the exchange rate flexibility, the fluctuations, the volatility, and the long-term decline. Long-term decline is happening in this country. Both are bad outcomes of weak foreign exchange. And secondly, the political implications of flexible exchange rate are also quite high because politically it is not wise to keep a flexible exchange rate when it tend to tends to always tend to fluctuate and result in a long-term downward path. So these are the two main reasons. Otherwise, exchange rate should be flexible and should be stable. But both cannot be maintained without export growth. So our export growth is very weak. So because of that, as a temporary measure, the government with the central bank, they try to intervene. That is the reason. Otherwise, when it is allowed to fluctuate according to market forces, it is good for the trade account. Okay, right. Okay, so then see you again next week.